good evening and welcome. My name is Michael Greenstone, and I'm very happy to welcome everyone here on behalf of the Becker-Friedman Institute and the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. I'm also delighted to welcome our incredible guests, who I will describe in a minute. And the conversation tonight is going to be to discuss a novel diplomatic and economic policy that was implemented in opposition to the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which is the price cap on Russian oil exports. And what I'll just say at the top, having worked in government for a year, it's very rare that anyone thought it was good for people who talked about markets or economists to really be near anything around diplomacy or military policy. And I think what makes this so interesting is that this was really an idea that was born out of markets, and we are incredibly understanding of markets. And we're incredibly fortunate to have Ben Harris, Ryan Kellogg, Konstantin Sonin, and Catherine Rempel with us today. But first, let me provide just a little background on this really important topic. So, as for starters, why focus on Russian oil exports? Well, oil and gas exports make up an incredibly high share of the Russian government's budget. In 2021, the last year before the war, they accounted for about 45% of the total budget. But if you look closely, it's not just oil and gas. Actually, most of that is driven by oil, and so it's quite sensible that oil was targeted. And so as policymakers considered their range of options in response to the Russian aggression, sharply limiting Russian oil export revenues kind of stood out as an immediate idea. And the idea being is war is expensive, and starving Russia of important ways to fund the war could, in theory, limit its ability to wage the war or restrict it in some way. On the other side, policymakers also recognized a key challenge in this equation, which is that oil is the lifeblood of the global economy. It's the essential fuel that powers all mobility from cars and trucks to planes and ships, and Russia is the world's third largest oil producer. Now, what adds further complication to that is demand for oil. It's not easy to suddenly swap out to a solar-powered plane or solar-powered ship. And so demand is incredibly, what economists like to call, inelastic. And so is there a way, this was a task that the policymakers took upon themselves, to restrict the revenues that Russia was receiving without restricting global supply in some way that led to larger economic repercussions for the whole world. And so makers were faced with this dilemma: reduce Russia's export revenue without reducing its oil exports. And the result of some very careful thinking was a novel solution. And so on December 5th, the G7 countries in Australia implemented a price cap on Russian oil at $60 a barrel. Countries can still buy Russian oil, but they face significant difficulties or barriers to paying anything above $60 per barrel. In theory, this cap can be ratcheted down to even more lower levels. And in addition, according to press reports, the same countries are finalizing two separate price caps on refined Russian petroleum products, diesel and fuel oil, that are due to take effect on February 1st. So this is like an incredibly novel policy. I think it's fair to say, I was not able to think of anything that has been tried where the use of markets was tried like this before in such a novel and clever way. And if successful, it will reduce Russia's export revenues and reduce its capacity to wage war in Ukraine, while also allowing the global economy to continue to move forward. So what are the results? Are the sanctions working? Tonight we're incredibly fortunate to have with us Ben Harris from the Treasury Department, who's going to give us an update on that. And following Ben's remarks, we have a Hall of Fame style panel here to digest the impacts of the price cap on the Russian economy so far, what this means for Putin's long-run strategy, possible effects on the long-run economy. Has the U.S. inadvertently identified another economic or diplomatic policy tool that could be applied in other settings. And I'm sure they'll cover all that and much more. And so with that, let me just introduce our guest. So Ben Harris currently serves as the Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy and Counselor to the Secretary at the U.S. Department of Treasury. Previously, he was a professor at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. I've been incredibly fortunate to know Ben for probably a decade or longer in various policy circles. And so he is our guest of honor. Ryan Kellogg is a professor and deputy dean for academic programs at our Harris School of Public Policy. His research agenda lies at the intersection of industrial organization with energy, environmental, economics, and policy. He's perfect to talk about the impact on oil markets. Catherine Rampell is, I've probably known Catherine for about a dozen years. Used to know her as a reporter that everyone wanted to talk to at the New York Times. And she was asking all the questions, and you always kind of half wondered, well, what was Catherine thinking? And so then she took a new job and became a columnist at the Washington Post. It became very easy to figure out what Catherine was thinking after that. And she has won a number of awards, and we're very fortunate to have her here with us today. And last but certainly not least is Konstantin Sonin, who is also my colleague at the Harris School. He's the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor at the Harris School. His research interests include political economics, development, and economic theory. He's from Russia. He earned a master's and PhD in math from Moscow State University and an MA in economics, which is redeeming quality, at Moscow's New Economics School. And in addition to his, really fundamental academic work, Konstantin has been writing columns and op-eds and a blog on Russian political and economic issues, which I recommend to everyone. So with that, let me get out of the way and hand it to Ben.
To start, let me just begin by setting the tone a little bit, and that when I speak about this issue and when people from the Treasury Department speak about this issue, I think we come to it with a fair amount of humility. And we come to it with humility for a few reasons. The most important reason is that on the other end of this policy are Ukrainian lives and a brutal war. And so, that type of motivation, I think, hangs over our heads all the time. The second reason we come to this with humility is for, as Michael noted, this is completely novel. And we are in the process of building this policy as we implement it. And so we never want to declare victory too early. We always need more analysis, more time to understand what's going on. And I'm sure we'll continue to refine it over time. But sort of to talk about the motivation for the price cap from the outset, when Russia invaded Ukraine now a year ago, it was a little bit like a tire company sprinkling nails on the highway and then being there at the end to fix all the tires and profit from it. So Russia created this awful crisis. We saw rises in energy prices, and then Russia was using this increased revenue to fight this war. And from our perspective, that was 100% unacceptable. So we needed a solution. And we had two primary goals from the outset. The first was to maintain stability in global energy markets as much as possible. So if there was a spike in energy prices like the one we saw at the onset of the war, that meant not just more pain for the United States, it meant obviously more pain for the global South and for countries who bear disproportionate pain when energy prices spike. It also means disproportionate pain for Ukraine and other countries that we obviously care deeply about. The second goal was then also to reduce revenue received by Russia. So we've always had these dual goals from the outset: stabilize global oil markets and reduce revenue as much as possible. And sometimes that seems like it's in tension with one another. So in June of 2022, the European Union put in place what is known as the Six Sanctions Package. And the Six Sanctions Package did two things. The first, it banned seaborne imports of Russian oil. So as of December 5th, Europe would no longer take crude off of tankers. And beginning February 5th, 2023, Europe would no longer accept refined product from Russia. The ban was consequential, but the really consequential part of the Six Sanctions Package was the second part, which banned companies from Western countries or from European countries in the sixth sanctions package from participating in the trade of Russian oil. So under the sixth sanctions package, you could not have a Greek ship with UK insurance carrying oil from Russia to Mumbai. It wasn't destined for a European port, but you couldn't use the Western services to transport that oil. This really mattered because, for example, at the time it was put in place, 90% of Russian oil was being traded on ships that carried UK insurance. And the UK was going to follow whatever the EU did. And so there was a real risk at the time of severe shut-in of Russian exports. Now, maybe that sounds like a great idea, but at the time, there was a real worry that this would spike the price of crude, and then later on in February, spike the price of refined products. So some of the analysts from places like JP Morgan thought that the price of oil would go to 185. Other analysts thought it'd be around 150. Some thought it'd be 130. But in general, there was a consensus that a ban on Western services to transport Russian oil meant a sharp spike in energy prices. Now, whatever your probability for a global recession is when oil is at 110 or 115, if it goes up to 185, double or triple that probability. 185 oil looks terrible for the global economy, looks terrible for developing economies, and it makes the oil that Russia is able to export that much more valuable. And so just to say from the outset, when Russia shuts in a barrel of production, two things happen. One, it doesn't receive the revenue from that export, but it makes all the other barrels that it can export that much more valuable. So our concern was that by shutting in Russian production, it would mitigate any of the impacts on revenue, and in sort of more extreme cases, it could actually offset all of the impact on revenue. So we had to do something, and the good-natured six sanctions package, we felt like we just wanted to introduce a slight adjustment to that and enter the price cap. And the idea was to say, you still have a ban from the EU on services used to transport Russian energy, but there's an exception on the ban, and that's if the Russian energy is traded for extremely low levels. And we saw an expansion of the coalition, so it's no longer just the EU, but joined by the rest of the G7 and also Australia. And so you have a broader coalition with which to implement this new regulation. So over the summer, we would travel to Europe and meet with our counterparts and start to hash out some of the details. Details like, will it just be a certain dollar per barrel cap, or will it be a spread? How will this be implemented? And so we spent an enormous amount of time talking with private industry because the orientation of this sanctions package was so different than anything that's been tried before. I mean, Michael's right. This was completely novel. Usually when you have sanctions, the Treasury Department or other entities that levy sanctions say, look, you can't trade good X with country Y. But this is completely different. We actually wanted the trade of Russian energy to continue just at low levels. And so it was imperative that we went to private industry and said, how can we make this work for you? Now, we settled on something called the attestation and record-keeping model, where oftentimes services that are involved in the trade of energy don't know the price of that energy. So you could be a ship owner who's carrying oil, and you may not know the price of that oil. Or you may be an insurance company housed in the UK, insuring a fleet of ships, and you don't know what the values are of the diesel being traded, or the kerosene, or the crude. And so we needed a model that would be flexible to the way that industry does business. And we came up with the attestation model and said, essentially, there are three different buckets of service providers. There are those like banks that know exactly what the price of the product is that's being carried. There are some that are some service providers that sometimes know the price of the oil that's being carried. And there are those service providers, like insurance companies, that almost never know the value of the energy being carried. And so the basic framework was to say, if you're a service provider and you don't know the value of the energy that's being carried on the ship or that's being traded, it's incumbent upon you to get an attestation from a reliable actor and then engage in record keeping. So basically just file it in a drawer for 5 years. And it was your responsibility to receive credible information. And if the Treasury Department felt like you were either intentionally skirting that obligation or going to a non-credible source, there would be action taken. Industry seems to think that this has been working. We're on the phone with them all the time. We've gotten relatively positive reviews. Russian barrels continue to flow, and roughly a quarter of them are traded under the price cap, as far as we can tell, for Russian crude. So here we are, 3.5 weeks into January, with this completely novel scheme. And so a reasonable question is, how is it working? And the price of Brent is $88, not $135, not $150, not $185. We're talking about a global economy which feels fairly stable, and price spikes are not on everyone's mind right now in terms of crude. And this general scheme seems to be working. And we're looking at Russian revenue. Now, the data is tough to come by, but by some estimates, we've reduced Russian revenue from the trade of oil by 35%. That's certainly a success. It's not an end game. We're not where we need to be, but Russia is undoubtedly making less money from crude than it did before. You're seeing widening spreads between the price of Brent, so non-Russian oil, and Russian oil. If I'd come and sat in this chair 13 months ago and said, guess what? Russian oil sells for $30 or more less than identical oil that just comes out of different soil, you would have said I was crazy. So what we've effectively done is bifurcated this market, and for a ton of reasons, not just the price cap, but partly probably because of the price cap, Russian oil is now seen as an entirely different commodity than oil from other places. And so it sells for much cheaper, and that's how we're able to achieve our dual objectives, which is, again, to stabilize oil markets while having lower revenue. Our next task, looking forward to February 5th, is to put price caps on refined product. So Russia exports about 2.5 million barrels of refined product every day. This is everything from kerosene and diesel, high-value refined product, to things like naphtha, which is used in petrochemicals and other things like that, that looks more like crude. But we looked across all these different product categories and tried to come up with a scheme that would work for refined product. And our suggested solution was to have a dual price cap. And our solution was to basically group all these refined products into two different categories. One was higher value refined product that typically trades for more than crude, and another was lower value refined product that trades for less than crude. And it's a little bit messy doing it this way. We could have a dozen different price caps, one on kerosene, one on vacuum oil, another on diesel. That felt a little too tough to implement. At the same time, just having one price cap seemed a little too, I want to say crude, but it's very hard to cap the price of one product, which is trading for $120, and another product which is trading for $50 with the same price. So our proposed solution, which has generally been accepted by the rest of the G7, is to have a dual cap, one for a group of products which typically trade for more than crude, and another for a set of products which typically trades for less. So, one question is, well, what are you going to set the price at? We don't know. We're engaged in conversations with the G7 and the rest of the coalition actively at this point. We don't know what the price will be, but the goal remains the same. The goal remains the same, which is to have Russian barrels continue to flow on ships to the global economy, but just at dirt cheap prices. And so, we're ultimately aiming to set the price caps as low as we can while preserving the ongoing trade of this various refined product. The last thing I'll say is people say, well, Russia will just shut in. There's no way you're going to sell into the price cap. I think we've already shown they will sell into the price cap, and they are selling into the price cap. But they may very well choose to roil global markets by shutting in oil production. But what we've done is we've created the incentives for them to continue trading. So we've set the price above the marginal cost of production. Russia still receives a little bit of profit. We're just trying to squeeze that profit. And if Russia ultimately decides to shut in energy, well, that means that the Russian economy will deteriorate even faster than it is already. So we've left them with no good options. And what we've done is basically cross off the list what Russia had been doing for so many months after its invasion, which is creating a crisis and profiting from it. That's no longer an option for Putin. That's no longer an option for Russia. So Russia only has bad options to choose from. So we're cautiously optimistic at this point. We have a lot of work ahead of us. And again, we're trying to stay humble and remember that the other end of this policy has lives at stake. So thank you. So I guess we can invite the rest of the panel up, and happy to have a conversation.
Thanks so much for those opening remarks. I actually wanted to start by asking you a question, and the other panelists can weigh in, of course, if you'd like. But my first question is, how did you decide where to set the price cap? Because the Ukrainians have argued that it's too high, right? I mean, if you look at the market price for Russian crude right now, much of it is trading below the cap that was set by the participating countries. So could you talk a little bit about how you respond to that criticism that it was perhaps set too high? How did you come upon the parameters that you ultimately decided on?
So the coalition is ultimately, because it's the EU, over 30 different countries that need to agree on a price. And all 30 countries, it has to be unanimous. I've spent my career basically focusing on domestic politics, where we only need to get 50% in the US Senate. So needing unanimous vote across the whole coalition is complicated. There are different countries that have different considerations. But why did we get to 60? Well, at the time that the price cap was set, we felt that there was quite a bit of Russian crude that was trading over 60. So 60 would be binding for some of the trades. There's a distribution of costs. So people often cite Urals, but Urals aren't the only Russian crude that's being traded. There's also ESPO being traded out of the east, which is typically much more expensive. And 60 also allowed us to get a cap in place. And so for so much of 2022, we've been having two discussions. One discussion was, can a price cap even work? And that was taking up the bulk of our energy. The second discussion was, if you are able to pull off a price cap, what's the right level? And we, from my view, wanted to stop having the first conversation and have a proof of concept, show it could work, familiarize industry with the notion of a price cap, familiarize industry with that attestation and record-keeping model that I mentioned, and then set a cap at $60 so that Russia would not be able to receive more than 60 for any barrel it exported, and then constantly reassess. And if market conditions and strategic considerations warranted ratcheting down the price cap on crude, then that's great, let's do that. But to start, let's just get the cap in place, show it can work, and then focus on exactly what the right level is.
Ryan, I know that you were one of the public supporters of this policy when it was first proposed. How do you judge whether it is working or not? I mean, certainly this is not the first time I've heard a member of the administration take credit for the fact that oil prices have not spiked as many predicted. But how do we disentangle how much credit to assign to this coalition's price cap policy, for example, versus other factors, including Chinese COVID-related problems, which might be reducing demand, fears of recession, and that sort of thing?
And this is one of those areas where it's really hard to assess exactly what's moving oil markets, and it becomes really important to keep in mind that we often try to talk about the global oil market and what the global price of oil is. In reality, and especially now, there isn't a single price of oil. So earlier Ben referenced the Brent price of oil. If you're not well versed in crude oil markets, that's the price of oil that's set for a particular grade in the North Sea. That's what most people talk about when they talk about the price of oil. Urals, Russian oil, historically traded a little bit less than that, a couple dollars. It's a little bit cruddier, a little bit dirtier. But now that gap's really opened up to $20 or $30 a barrel. Some of that opening happened well before the price cap policy and the sanctions came into place, though, after the war, just from pure stigma of having any transactions with Russia whatsoever. We have seen that differential blow out even more post December 5th, when the sanctions package and the price cap came into place. And in fact, sort of, at least for some of the Russian oil, it is trading actually below the level of the price cap itself. How much of that is directly because of the price cap? How much of that is from just the straight up EU import sanctions? Those two things are hard to pick apart. The way I think about it, and the reason I was sort of supportive of this policy from the very beginning, is that, even with all the uncertainty, doing a policy like this is clearly better than doing nothing at all. It has a very good chance of having impacts. Right now, sort of the quote, the Brent global price of oil is so low that some of the Russian oil is actually trading below the cap. And the policies seem to have very little downside. Yes, there's the risk that Russia would shut in its production, either for economic or strategic reasons. It hasn't done that yet. It seems as long as things continue as they are, it seems like that's probably not going to happen, which makes this a pretty attractive policy from all those perspectives, even with all the difficulties in disentangling, how in a world where we didn't do this, how much more dollars per barrel would Russia be getting?
And how do you think about this question, Konstantin?
I also think, like Ryan, that the magnitude of the discount for Russian oil is a sign that this is not something that happens to the oil market in general, like because of China COVID. This is something that happens to Russian oil, not to oil in general. I think that it's probably difficult to disentangle the exact mechanism. For example, the price for Russian oil might be lower because China and India want to have a higher discount now that they have a better bargaining position, but it actually does not matter, because what matters is that Russia receives less revenue from this oil.
And Ben, how do we think about the actual economic, or is there a way to estimate the actual economic impact this is having on Russia based on the discount that Russian oil is trading at, the volume of oil that they are still selling, either in the cap or outside of the cap? How do you think about, is there a metric for the actual cost, or an estimate for the actual cost to Russia? And how does that compare to the cost of the war, let's say?
So it's tough to run a counterfactual for all the reasons that were just explained. What is true is that when Russia did its budgeting, if they were receiving $70 a barrel, they estimated they would have not a surplus, which they've run for many, many years, but a 2% deficit. That's at $70 a barrel for Russia receiving on its exports. So if they're only receiving, as they are now, $52, $54 a barrel, their fiscal position is markedly worse. There's also another impact of the sanctions, which happen over time, which is that as Russia has less and less access to Western technology, Russian oil production is fairly primitive relative to many of the producers in the Middle East, for example. And as the Western companies left Russia, and as Western countries have put export restrictions on certain equipment and technology that would be used for oil production, the ability for Russia to produce over time diminishes. So the combination of all of this and the impact over time is important. But as far as like a specific dollar amount, it's tough to pinpoint. But we think it's been substantial already. And remember, we haven't even set the caps on refined product yet. So 6 months from now, ideally the war will be over. But 6 months from now, a year, hopefully we'll have more data to say. But the only thing I can say, Catherine, is I think it's been substantial.
When we spoke before this panel, I think Ryan and Konstantin had some back-of-the-envelope estimates. I don't know if either of you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, if you wanted to think about a very rough back-of-the-envelope, and this isn't the sort of thing where you sort of assign a calculation to a specific policy like the price cap or the embargo. You can sort of look at the spread between, say, the Brent price versus, say, the current Urals price, and that spread is on the order of $20 to $30 a barrel, whereas it used to be much smaller than that before the war and before any of these policies took place. Think about sort of the value of Russian production in total, Russia produces around 10 million barrels a day total, and I agree we could probably expect that to decline over the coming years as sort of Russian technology degrades without its ability to import either Western capital or expertise. The total value of that crude oil, you can do a very rough calculation of $10 million by that gap of $20 to $30 per barrel. That kind of gets you to a very big number in terms of total value very quickly, on the order of $200 to $300 million per day. Not all of that oil is exported. Only a share of that oil is exported. The exports are on the order of 4 to 5 million barrels a day, I think, so maybe half that. But this is real money. Again, that sort of Brent to Urals gap of $20 to $30, that's coming from a combination of things. Some of it's the price cap, some of it's the sanctions, some of it is pure stigma, some of it is India and China now being able to drive hard bargains as the primary buyers of Russian crude oil. But that's a pretty big revenue hit relative to where global oil prices currently are.
And Konstantin, can you put that in context of what the war costs, what we think the war costs, how painful this actually is for Russia?
Okay, tragically, Russia started this war being like a kind of in a good financial position. The war was unprovoked. Russia was prepared. Russia is a huge country and a relatively rich country. It's a rich country with poor people, but it's a rich country. So Russia has a huge stockpile of munitions. So it's not that it has kind of a very high capacity to produce all these tanks, but it has been producing tanks for 50 years and now use this whole stockpile. So I think the impact of the diminished revenues, it's visible, it's clear, the economy is in decline, but still the capacity to keep doing what Russia does is still high.
Is there any level at which this price could be set that would be more painful in your view?
Oh, okay. It's painful, and at some point, this will perhaps become intolerable because the war costs more, and it's more difficult to recruit people. They have to spend more money to produce, even like to keep the war going. So this will become painful. What I'm saying that, unfortunately, it cannot become that painful that just for this reason alone, Russia would stop waging war.
So the Russian government is famously very secretive about releasing data, including what people are or what buyers might be paying for oil. Could you talk a little bit about how you back out some of your estimates to figure out how much they are exporting and at what price?
So, great question. Russian oil trade, this is not the New York Stock Exchange, right? So we're not entirely sure what everything is being traded for. I think we're relatively confident about volume, although there's some uncertainty there. But when it comes to price, you've got this term price discovery. It's interesting, the companies that report on Russian energy trade, they report the prices, they actually refer to themselves as journalists. It's that hard to actually find the information about Russian trades. They refer to themselves as journalists, which I think is reflective of the difficulty. So, we speak with industry all the time. We generally talk in ranges rather than point estimates. And we talk in averages, over a month or so rather than on a particular day. But so in general, I think that our best information is obtained by speaking with those who know this market the best, and those are the journalists that try to report on trades or get information from various trades, but it's an opaque situation.
Do you have, Konstantin, do you have thoughts on how much you can trust any of these numbers?
No, I think these numbers are better than any other numbers. I'm not sure that Putin in Kremlin has much better numbers than that. For what we know, they operate with very bad like data, and even when they collect this data, they report it in a way that it's impossible to make, advised decision. Putin doesn't make them, certainly. So I think this data is as good as it gets. Although it would be interesting to talk to a CIA director about this data.
Perhaps a different perspective. So Ryan, what do we know about how the market / Russia has adapted to these new conditions? As Ben laid out, oil can be sold and insured by non-coalition partners. Are we seeing, for example, a rise in Chinese insurers that are willing to insure or finance these transactions? Are we seeing a lot more tankers being purchased by Russia so that they don't have to rely on Western tankers? Could you talk a little bit about what's
I can
changed?
say a little bit, but part of my answer is going to go back to what Ben just said, that a lot of these transactions are indeed opaque in terms of who's insuring which ships and things like that. It is possible to track ships as they move about, whether their transponders are on or off. They can try to make it difficult, but we have people who are able to track these sorts of things. A combination of things has been happening. So in part, a lot of Russian crude used to be going to the EU. That's a fairly short journey, and those tankers would be insured by financial companies in the UK or elsewhere in Europe, perhaps the US as well. Now those journeys are much longer. They're going to China, they're going to India, other countries as well, but those have been the two main buyers where a lot of those EU volumes have gone to. That's a much longer journey. That raises costs. You have tankers that used to carry Russian crude that may not be willing to carry it anymore, so you need to find new tankers. And then you need to find new insurers. And it's, over time, if this persists for a long time, are we going to start to see a Chinese reinsurance industry popping up, or other entities that help facilitate these kind of transactions popping up? Maybe over the long run. These are not the sort of things you can set up overnight, though. Like if you want to set up an insurer for a crude vessel where you need a lot of insurance, both for the cargo itself and for the damage that might happen in the event that there is a spill. Like these are the big reasons why insurance is required. You need a lot of capital to back that up because oil spills are catastrophic and cost billions of dollars. You don't set up these kinds of companies overnight. And part of the challenge that's been imposed by the sanctions is requiring these vessels either to find insurance through unusual channels or perhaps try to travel completely uninsured, both of which are really hard.
Konstantin, are there other adaptations that we have seen so far, like oil mixing, for example?
Okay, I don't know. I would expect that there will be oil mixing because that's something that was seen on a large scale when there were sanctions against Iraq and then Iran. And I'm certain that some European countries might want to do this oil mixing. At the same time, I know that in other industries, there was less cooperation from firms in the countries that are not participating in sanctions than was expected by Putin. For example, Chinese firms do much less to increase imports than was expected. So I'm not sure that, I don't know, but I'm not sure that Chinese reinsurance companies would jump in and in the hope to circumvent sanctions. Even if there are a lot of money to make on arbitrage, still there are a lot of disincentives to do this.
So you don't think that there's a risk that in creating this incentive for Chinese competitors, like there isn't a growing industry that will now compete with Western insurers?
I think this is one of the reasons why it's good to have a price ceiling which is not too low, because the lower it goes, the higher are incentives to arbitrage on this, to go around this. And now it still leaves Russian companies with some profits, but there is less profit to make by avoiding sanctions.
Yep.
And just to add to that, part of the overall policy objective is to use this set of policies combined with a bunch of other things to actually end the war as quickly as possible. In a world where there is this possibility that the war ends with Russia losing, these policies go away, meaning that it becomes very difficult if you're a Chinese entity that's thinking about entering this market. This is a market that all of a sudden stops existing the moment the war ends and these policies then go away.
Ben, could you talk a little bit about how monitoring and enforcement of this works? I mean, we've been talking about ways that legally, avoid the sanctions, but presumably there are plenty of ways to evade them as well. You know, how do we know that there aren't side payments being made, for example, so that a transaction looks like it's below the cap even when it's not? How do you, how does Treasury, how do the other coalition members actually make sure that that private companies are abiding by these sanctions?
So the first point to make is to make a distinction between evasion and subversion. So evasion would be, for example, using a Greek ship to carry Russian oil for crude for $65 a barrel, and then lying about the price of that oil. That's evasion. Subversion is using, say, a Chinese ship with Chinese insurance and Chinese financing to carry oil from Russia to a Chinese port. There's nothing in that that violates any of our sanctions policy. That's perfectly fine. So this really is not a cap. I mean, price cap is a bit of a misnomer. What it is a conditional exception on a package which banned the use of Western companies to trade Russian oil. Now, that's a mouthful, but that's to say, if you're not using Western companies, go crazy and trade for whatever you want. And so when we're talking about evasion, we're talking strictly about G7 companies. The second point to make is that we have seen much more examples of overcompliance rather than undercompliance. And by that I mean a lot of companies have just exited the trade of Russian product. And again, remember, we have this dual objective, which is to reduce revenue but maintain supplies on global markets, which means we need the participation of Western companies, but just at really, really low prices. And so when companies say, look, we're not even going to participate, you know, we've kind of failed to do our job, perhaps, because we do need those Russian barrels to hit the market. But we've seen much more examples of overcompliance rather than, I mean, we really have not seen examples of pure evasion yet. Now, we've been explicit, so our Office of Foreign Asset Control at the Treasury Department has been explicit in its guidance that says things like selling or buying Russian oil crude for $58 and then giving $5 worth of nickel as a side payment between Moscow and the buyer, that is an explicit violation. That's evasion. But we haven't seen any examples of that yet. And Treasury is pretty familiar with this. I mean, you don't have to be brilliant to say, look, oh, maybe I could sell it for cheaper and give you money on the side. I mean, we're pretty well versed in these type of tactics, but haven't seen them yet, to my knowledge.
It just seems like it would be much easier to monitor whether there's a violation of an outright ban on transactions than these kinds of conditions. Are the terms of the contract abiding by the sanctions? Like, if the sanction were you cannot buy oil from Russia, you can use satellites presumably to see if the tankers are leaving Russia. But now you can see that their tankers are leaving, but you don't actually know what they're trading at. So it does seem like it would be a much more challenging enforcement question.
So I see your point, but this is not, you know, these are not like there's 40 tankers a day leaving Russia. I mean, we can count on, you know, both hands. These are giant ships in general. We know where they are. And again, we're talking about one price, right? This is not terribly complicated. It's like, how much does the crude cost? It costs 58, that's fine. It costs 67, that's not fine. So it's not all that complicated in principle. I take your point that it's different and, you know, there is something pure about a ban. But conceptually, this isn't terribly difficult, and companies get it, and they just need that one piece of paper with that one price on it to show they're complying with the regime.
Konstantin, various Kremlin officials have threatened some form of retaliation in the face of this price cap policy. What realistic options do you think Russia has? Ben had said earlier that we've left them with no good options. Do you agree with that assessment? Are you worried about a shut-in, for example?
I'm not much worried about the words that Russian officials say. In fact, when I was living in Russia, and last time I was living for 8 months last year until March, I was not actually paying attention to what they say. I mean, Putin typically puts up like a word salad of different things, and he says he doesn't feel responsible for what he says. So I always told people to pay attention to what he does, not to what he says. And we've seen this thing about oil and gas. This was this gambit about paying in rubles, although of course when you sell something, it's exchange of imports for your gas, so it does not actually matter what you're exchanging for. So they talked about this for a couple of months, and this topic then died out. So I think they talk about retaliation. I'm not sure that they could do anything. One thing is that to actually shut down production, Putin needs to tell the elite, and Russian elite includes dozens of thousands of people who work in oil and gas industry. There are thousands of millionaires working there. And to tell them that things are not going according to the plan, that's not something that Putin has done yet. They have started to talk to general population that this is a kind of existential war for Russia. But for the elite, it's still, no, everything is going according to the plan. And shutting down oil production will actually be a kind of a huge violation of Putin's contract, not with general Russian population, but with his supporters who support him because they benefit from his rule. So I wouldn't bet on this.
I thought there was some evidence that Russian oil production had declined. Is that not right?
Oh, when oil prices go down, production declines marginally. That's normal.
But no more than...
Yeah, right. Okay. So, but there are no information about any kind of shutting down production on orders to raise the price or raise the pressure.
We saw, there were a lot of analysts who predicted in October that Putin would shut in order to put political pressure on the United States in advance of the election. And some analysts were sure this would happen. Now, it didn't happen. And so the question is, why did this not happen? And the reason it didn't happen is because 30% of Russia's revenue comes from the trade of crude, and another 15% comes from the trade of refined product. Energy is the Russian economy. And this is an economy which is increasingly desperate, which is seeing financial flight, it's seeing human capital flight. It has turned, as we mentioned earlier, from surplus to deficit. It's seeing companies flee as fast as they can get out of Russia. This is a desperate economy. They can't afford to turn off the spigots. So they did it in October like people said they might. And look, I don't know what they're going to do moving forward, but if they do, it's going to hurt. And that's our point from the outset.
Well, it sort of depends on how you draw the supply curve, right? If they reduce production, but that drives up the price sufficiently to offset the lost quantity of sales, they could still benefit, no?
So that's a good point. We don't see the markets being that tight where shut-in would compensate for all of the lost revenue. Shut-in still means, they would shut in, if that was true, they would have done it already. So there's also reasons not to shut in. One is that if they shut in production of crude, again, these are really primitive wells in most cases, not all cases. But these are really primitive wells. They rely on maintaining a certain pressure in order to maintain production. And if Russia shuts down too many of these are drying up for good. And they're very hard to unstick once you've shut down production. So it's not like these are not Saudi wells. They can't turn them on and off. It also, you have to ask the question of who will be hurt by this. Remember that India and China are buying Russian oil. The United States has already said we're not buying Russian exports. So shut-in also means telling some of your best customers that you're not going to be there, and I think there are also political reasons for not doing that.
Brian, Michael, in his opening remarks, invoked one question that I think many people have is this novel policy tool something that could have applications beyond Russia? For example, this is the creation of a buyer's cartel. There is an existing seller's cartel, OPEC plus. Is this a tool that you could see being used in other settings, perhaps for other policy objectives?
So there has been talk of a global sort of buyer's cartel for oil for many years now, probably 10, 20 years at least. The idea behind this sort of long before the conflict between Russia and Ukraine was an idea to form a counterweight to OPEC, the famous sellers cartel of oil, by basically banding together the large oil-consuming countries, agreeing not to import or consume so much, and drive down the global price of oil as a way of doing that. So you can imagine sort of a world where sort of you take sort of this price cap policy that we've been talking about, and in some sense just go big with it, and instead of targeting it, say, at just Russia, target it at actually reducing the global sort of quote the global price of oil. Actually, sort of try to drive the Brent price of oil down. I would see that as a pretty hard, difficult thing to actually succeed at for a number of reasons. One, we've been talking about all the challenges with monitoring and evasion around the policy that we've just implemented. There are challenges there. There are sort of reasonable reasons to think that sort of with monitoring and enforcement we can overcome it. When we think about employing that at sort of as a way to target the global price of oil, take all those challenges and, I don't know, square them, cube them, add a couple zeros. The incentives to cheat become much larger. A larger set of actors, both state and private, have all sorts of incentives to deviate, engage in side payments to try and get around any price cap you might set. So doing this sort of buyer's club idea, at least with a price cap tool, seems challenging. I will add, if you were going to try to engage in a way to try and reduce the global price of oil, there is actually one way to do it that I wouldn't call it, that's very distinct from the price cap. A carbon price, actually sort of taxing gasoline and taxing crude oil imports. It's actually a way to do it. What does a carbon price do? It drives down demand for oil. That's going to reduce the global pre-tax price of oil. That would be one way to do it.
Ben, do you want to weigh in on whether this has other policy applications?
Yeah, let me just be crystal clear about this. This is not a global buyers club. This is distinctly aimed at oil that comes out of Russian soil or on refined product, which is refined in Russian refineries. This is not designed to be anything more than that. This is strictly aimed at Russia. It is not broader than that, and we've been crystal clear about that from the beginning.
Constantine, how credible do you, if you're the Saudis, how credible do you find that answer?
Okay, I don't know about Saudis, but if I were Netherlands or United Kingdom, I would not invade a neighboring country because I fear that there might be a cap on our Dutch oil.
But
it's quite seriously. There are very few countries in the world that have oil reserves compared to Russia, like Venezuela, Iran, of countries that sort of mismanage their resources, and none of them poses that much of a global or huge local threat as Russia. So this is an extremely powerful tool, but I'm not sure that, or I hope that the history will not have an occasion to use this tool in.
But presumably it could be used not as punishment, but because Western consumers want cheaper petroleum products.
The thing is that the current cap, it relies on a coalition of countries, very diverse coalition with very different interests, and some of them certainly are hurt by these sanctions, but since they consider Russian invasion of Ukraine totally something that contradicts everything that, I don't know, we exist for, they are willing to participate in this cap. So that's why it works. So if there are other circumstances in which there will be such a huge agreement, such a diverse coalition of countries that want to participate, then it would work.
Ben, could you talk a little bit about other tools we have been using against Russia and how well you think this particular policy performs in the context of other sanctions that we have put in place? Part of the reason I ask is that there's been some reporting suggesting that Russian exports are back up, non-fuel exports, I should say, are back up. And in fact, I think exports to Central Asia are above their pre-war levels, which suggests that there might be some pass-through to the rest of the world. How do you think about the full suite of sanctions that have been imposed and how successful they've been?
So these things take time. They've been historic. I think if you look at them from a comprehensive view, what we've done over time. This is truly historic. Everything from Russian assets to the speed with which we have put in place sanctions. There have been 9 sanctions packages put in place by Western allies that have been largely coordinated and have addressed everything from the financial sector to weaponry. Of course, our support for Ukraine is also part of the suite of tools used to end this war as quickly as possible. But I do think, again, for a country which relies on energy trades for 50% of its revenue, I mean, the marginal tax rate on oil production is something like 75% for oil. I mean, this oil is how Russia gets money to fight this war over time, and it's imperative that we cut back on it if we want to, ultimately undercut their ability to fight this war. So, credit the United States and our allies for putting in place really innovative tools across the board, but I don't think it'd be complete unless we address the oil trade.
Ryan, Ben spoke earlier about the evolving policy process to impose new price caps on refined products. How much more challenging do you think that will be? I think Secretary Yellen made some public remarks recently saying she thought it would be a lot more challenging. But could you talk a little bit about how different that market is?
I mean, refined products are complicated in the sense that there are lots and lots of varieties of refined products. Gasoline, diesel, different types of diesel, kerosene, heavy fuel oil, the list goes on and on, jet fuel, which is kind of close to kerosene. How do you think about setting price caps for each of these different products, keeping in mind all the challenges we've already been talking about with crude, where for lots of this conversation, we've been talking about crude as a homogeneous product, but Ben's reminded us a couple times that even Russian crude is not a homogeneous thing. And all the same considerations apply. Like, how do you set a price cap that balances the risk of evasion? How do you set a price cap that balances the risk that, for products, the risk is that Russia will simply stop refining it and therefore stop exporting it and drive global fuel prices up. And in particular, the global market for diesel happens to be very tight right now. So if you drive around town in Chicago and drive by a gasoline station that happens to also sell diesel, you'll see a diesel price that's about $1 a gallon more than the price of regular unleaded gasoline. That is a big gap historically, and it's because sort of the global refining industry is running flat out and at capacity trying to produce enough diesel to satisfy global diesel demand. So there's risk there of what happens if the price cap on refined products goes awry and Russia actually reduces its diesel output. So balancing that is going to be really tricky.
And Konstantin, what do we know about how countries that have not been party to this coalition have been affected by the price cap?
Okay, I think that, basic economics tells us that those countries that were buyers of oil, they should benefit, especially those who are buyers of the Russian oil, right? We know, it's sort of anecdotal, but there is a lot of evidence that the discount on Russian oil is actually huge. So this means that the buyers actually benefiting. They're better off from this cap. In fact, they're sort of a secret ally of the price cap because they benefit. They are sort of subsidized by the cap.
China is not party, but not part of the coalition, but they get a deal.
They benefit, cynically, they benefit in so much ways from what happens in Russia. On every trade with Russia, any Chinese company, any Chinese bank just got a huge bargaining power. Their margins increased all across the board. Now their auto companies, they replace all the foreign companies that were operating in Russia. So it's in every industry they benefit.
Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, any purchaser of crude has benefited from this. And sometimes I get asked, well, isn't this just a benefit for Chinese refineries? I think that oversimplifies it, but I agree 100%. Chinese and Indian refineries purchasing cheap Russian crude have certainly been a beneficiary. We're fine with that. We are fine with the rents getting distributed around the globe as long as it's not Russia. Also, sort of talking, but sort of agreeing with Ryan and his point about refined product. I mean, these are really tight markets right now. Russia refines, again, 2.5 million barrels a day of refined product. Roughly 800,000 barrels are diesel. Diesel markets are really tight, as Ryan mentioned. There's really very little excess global capacity to produce more diesel. So if Russia shuts in, either because they're forced to or because they choose to, shuts in that roughly 1 million barrels a day of diesel, what needs to happen? Well, the prices need to rise sufficiently high so that the consumption of diesel declines. And what does that mean? That means Ukrainian hospitals and schools which are running on generators powered by diesel because the electric grid has been so damaged. That means that they have to pay more for diesel. That means landlocked African countries, which are going to increasingly rely on Russian diesel, might see shortages. I mean, some of these countries only have really minimal reserves, and particularly the landlocked ones that aren't directly, they don't have seaborne ports, could see shortages at worst or at best see spike in prices. So it's imperative that we put in place the incentive that Russia can continue to produce because the United States, we're net exporters of refined product. The economies will really be hurt by a spike in diesel prices, I think I found, in other regions. And there's a potential for shortage if things get really bad.
Do you think that there are other lessons to be drawn from this conflict and its economic impact on the United States and on the rest of the world about our reliance on these petrostates for the lifeblood of our economies? I mean, can you put in context a little bit? We've been talking about the war, we've been talking about oil markets and petroleum markets, but are there implications for how we should be thinking about other energy sources, for example?
So I really don't want to get over my skis on this one. But I was the economic advisor for the Biden campaign, and at Treasury we're implementing the Inflation Reduction Act right now. And I think a central economic message out of the Biden administration's economic policy has been resiliency, and not just for energy, but for all supply chains. And that was a major motivation behind chips and reshoring of semiconductors. So I think that economies around the globe are looking at the sourcing for everything from energy to other critical minerals and other supply chains and asking about the reliability of those producers. The other, I don't want to leave without making this point. I think the other lesson, and I think my co-panelists alluded to this earlier, is the solidarity that we've seen across the G7. Some of these countries are making enormous sacrifices. So Mediterranean states in Europe, whose economies depend largely on the continued flow of oil, are certainly risking their well-being by agreeing to the price cap. Sacrifices made by, I just got back from the Baltic states and from Poland. You go into a government building in the Baltic states, and rather than having all these lights on, they're all unscrewed except for a single light bulb. The heat, if it's turned on at all, is 10 degrees beneath what would be comfortable. They'll ask you to take the stairs rather than the elevator, so not to use that energy. The resolve from our European partners is incredible, it's remarkable, and it's honestly been a true honor working with them on this. And I think the one thing that's come out of this is whether or not the price cap works or not, the solidarity around this type of invasion is just crystal clear. And I think we've proven that over the past few months.
And Konstantin, we've talked a lot about judging whether the price cap has been effective at reducing prices, keeping oil flowing. How would we judge whether it is effective at changing Putin's behavior?
Okay, I think that in a sense it's successful because the less dollars Russia gets, the less bombs are bought, the less microchips are bought, the less people are recruited to fight there. So just the less bombs on Ukraine. So you could think about these measures as, as like air defense. Air defense cannot shut down all the missiles, but it's still to better have air defense. So it already helped. These measures, they already help to reduce the burden, the pain of Ukrainians. I think that eventually this will contribute if Russia has when Russia has a responsible government, a government that would care about people, they would be thinking about this in a very different terms. They will be thinking about the war in terms that Russia will have to pay for decades to repair what is destructed in Ukraine. It will pay for decades because it lost European markets and they probably would never return. So I think a more responsible government would just take into account this to a much larger extent than the Putin government does.
And thank you especially to our esteemed panelists for really thoughtful responses. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. Thanks.